Getting my windows sorted out and acknowledging things. Great. Okay. So thank you, everybody. Leland asked me what I wanted to talk about. My normal response in those situations is, well, what do you think is of interest to the group? Here's a list of things I like to talk about, people that have worked with me before, and I'll give Ken a wave here. Um, know that I love to talk about what's relevant to people and what's top of mind, much more so than just throwing Agile content out, whether that's my deepest held Agile beliefs or if it's specific to a framework or whatever. It's not about me. It's about the people I'm speaking to and supporting. So in that conversation, WIP has been one of my challenging areas to address in organizations since I've started working with large companies. And that's been 15 years now of working with Agile at scale in one capacity or another. And I'm going to ask, by the way, Bill and others, if you can mute yourselves. The background noise is a little distracting. Um, and Leland jumped on this one out of a laundry list as well. I think because it resonates with anybody who's working in a large company. We are flooded with great ideas. And I can't remember the original source. It was on the back of one of Ewan's business cards, but there is this quote that said, kill all the good ideas so that the great ideas can thrive. And that mindset of really creating focus in the enterprise so that we can achieve what we're capable of is one that escapes leadership team after leadership team. And that's the conversation I'm going to lead through here. And I've got my intro slide, so I'll flip through it, but feel free to hit me up on Twitter, email me, or LinkedIn, or whatever. Say you heard me here. Enough about me. Today, I want to talk about WIP as it impacts us in the enterprise. I've worked in startups. I've worked at a 6-person, very small scale startup 15 years ago, and I've worked in the Fortune 5 as trying to lead agile transformations and lead enterprise change. And while the scale of the problems are different, the same problems exist. And today I want to look at work in process and the flood of distractions that harms us as people and as companies through these 6 lenses. First, I'm going to share a story with you. It's one that was very personal to me because I was part of the problem, and those are the most fun stories to tell for me. And then from there, I want to talk about what it feels like to be a leader in that. I think a lot of us, I'm going to make some assumptions that if you're in this call, you're probably in a transformation, coaching, consulting, supporting type role. I'm guessing there's not too many people that are in executive leadership roles. So I want to talk a little bit about what it feels like to be a leader and the empathy I've gained for the executives I've partnered with across these various companies. And then start to baseline, what's our common language, dig deeper into the problems and the emergence and the type of work, because I see that that's a driver to how to solve these problems. And then I'll introduce a set of strategies for addressing WIP, but like most strategies, they're big, they take time. And I'll address a handful of tactics, little things that we can do immediately to start making the environment slightly easier to work in that ideally creates room for those bigger strategies. I will pause for questions roughly at the end of each section. If you have questions, queue them up in the chat. I am generally pretty good at multitasking and reading the chat flow. If I miss something, toss it at me during the section breaks when I pause for questions. But first, Sherry asked me to put up the contact slide. I'm going to highlight it at ER Willicke. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm the only person in technology with my name. So first, let me tell a brief story. I was sitting in a big room planning. It was PI planning for a business unit, represented 150 odd developers. It was part of a $100 million business unit. Not a trivial environment, but also not overwhelmingly complex either. This product was part of a larger enterprise that itself had hundreds of products, a huge overall set of environments, and lots of stuff going on at a company level. And I was talking with the VP of product, smart guy, I'd worked with him for years, knew how to get things done, very good at juggling complexity and product and really thinking about customers and all that. And we were standing at the board where we just finished visualizing all of the work that was on his plate for the next PI. And he had 37 initiatives, not features, 37 corporate initiatives or change efforts that he was trying to track and their influence on his teams over those 150 people. He couldn't even keep this straight. He wasn't able to think about each one of those, but he had to report on each of them weekly. He had meetings about them. He was spending probably 30 hours a week just juggling that stuff. And those initiatives, they boiled down, or they kind of decomposed down to 600 items that his teams would have to do over the next couple of quarters. He had 8 teams in his group, and his larger group, but he had 8. That didn't count as other goals. That was not including his actual product goals and the things that he wanted to achieve on behalf of the company and meet his margin growth, et cetera, goals. You guys feel for this leader a little bit? Does that feel like a situation you might have seen before? Yeah. So let's rewind a few months earlier in time. So I'm in a executive session working with the general managers across that set of products. And they were talking about an organizational initiative and proposed, and it's like, this is really good. And this was an important one. This is not a bad idea. This is not like we're making work. This is like, we really should do this. This will help our bottom line across all of our products. It's going to be a really good thing. And then a group of general managers is really supporting us. It's amazing. And they get back together a month later for the follow-on. It's like, that's working. We're good at this. Let's start to build more of these. There's a couple more that will really have an impact on the bottom line. And they'll make it easier to build products, and they'll help us be successful. And that as well were full of good ideas and is exactly what they should. So they got it moving. And they met again a couple quarters later. This is, by the way, just before I was in the room with that VP, and they're continuing to put their good ideas in. Those are all great ideas. These are executives who understand their business, they understand the goals, they understand what they're trying to achieve, and they're pushing this to make the company better. And those organizational initiatives cascaded into a huge pile of product level initiatives that had an uncountable number. Well, it was countable, but it was a very large number in the thousands of essentially stories that needed to be done to achieve those initiatives. And those were being overlaid on top of all these products. And that is where this VP, that's where his pile of work came from. It's not that any of those individual items were bad ideas. In fact, each of them represented focus. But when you're standing at this executive altitude, you're suggesting one thing per quarter. When you're receiving it from another organization perspective, from a train level or team level perspective, you're receiving dozens or hundreds of things. So if you're in that executive environment, if you're in any level of leadership, what are you to do in this environment? First, I like to look at the problem. We need to understand and define the impact of the problems. So one thing I like to do is start by connecting to the problem directly and personally. What is the product and the financial impact that happens here? And we see the list. We're Agilists. We know how to talk about this. Of course, where you have too much work, it's going to make things take longer. Our quality is going to go down. Every feature is going to become more expensive and less predictable. We're going to be rushing, so we're not going to deliver products that are as fit for purpose. They're not going to be as good for our users. Experience will start to suffer because we're just putting things out there piecemeal to try to solve these problems. We're kind of doing all the things we say not to do in Agile product management, but we're doing them with the best intentions of trying to get all this work done. And then there's a human side of this as well. As a leader, I'm also highlighting the personal challenges that leaders cause here. We are adding stress to our people. That is damaging the personal health of the individuals that we rely on to lead our company that we hopefully care about as humans. They're getting burned out. The trust and the health of the relationships inside the organization start to degrade. Part of my personal definition of business agility is organizational health as one of the key components. So I care deeply about this from agility perspective and from a human perspective. And of course, when you're busy, somebody trying to collaborate you feels a heck of a lot like being interrupted. So we stop collaborating as much because we feel like we're being interrupted as we have our very limited time to do this small amount of work or this huge amount of work. So we're harming people, we're harming the company, and yet why isn't this obvious? Well, it is obvious. The leaders that I've talked to at every level of organizations know it's a problem. They just don't know what to do about it. But it needs to start with each individual leader at any level of the organization, starting by saying, yes, I will take responsibility for this problem, not out of shame, not out of obligation, and I'm certainly not going to justify the problem or lay blame at the feet of others. I'm going to respect that this problem came from well-intentioned activities, trying to grow an organization in the right direction, and also accept responsibility that the culture and the system is working exactly as we as leaders designed it to work. After all, we're responsible. We set up the organization. At a different company in the Fortune 50, I was sitting in the room with the chief technology officer and his entire senior vice president leadership team, and he looked them all in the eye and said, well, it's working like we designed it. And we have to own fixing it. And I loved that moment of responsibility. That's what I'm talking about here. You, as leaders, whatever your role as managers, you created the culture. You built the system that yielded this set of behaviors. The good news in that is you can also be the ones who change it. And I love this language. My colleagues and co-founders, Veronica and Christine, use all the time in their habit building work. I am the kind of leader who starts to fix the problem. I am choosing to start fixing these problems. It becomes part of my identity. If I do that, I start to have impact. Just to correct the chat, Ronica Roth, not Veronica. Longtime CST, many of you probably know her. So as we choose responsibility, we have to recognize there isn't any easy solution. We've talked about this forever. I think I shared the first version of this talk publicly almost 10 years ago at this point. We know it's a problem. And here's the secret. Just naming it isn't an insight. I've watched consultants, one of them might have been me, walk into an executive and say, hey, I figured out the solution to all your problems. You've got too much work. And the executive looks at me, and depending on what kind of executive they are, they either mentored me in the moment, as I was lucky enough to have, or they dismiss you and say, cool, another consultant we're not going to work with. Because that's obvious. Of course, there's too much work. The question is, how do we solve it? And to do that, we need a common language, and we need to look at how we are going to solve this problem. So let's talk about that common language. Different parts of the Agile and Lean communities have used very similar but subtly different words for talking about the physics of work for a good long while. So let's talk about how long things take. I have a very simple definition. It's from the time somebody has the great idea that they want something till the time it is in their hands and they are gaining value from it. That is what I call customer lead time or time to market. We as technologists know that we're going to take that great idea and we're going to drop it in a pile with all the other great ideas, and it's going to sit there for a good long while. And then we get started, we work on it, and we deliver it, and it's all good. And that's the time and process. Some people call that one lead time. I find that confusing. I call it time and process so I can explicitly say this is how long we're working on it. But we also know that this is itself a little too abstract. There's more that goes on. We have to figure out what this thing is. After a little while of it sitting there, we say we think it works, and then it sits for a little while, and then a tester picks it up and says, sorry, it doesn't work as designed. And then we work on it a little bit more, and then the tester says, yeah, it works great. And then at that point, we finally ship it, and it sits on a pile for a little bit and then goes out the door. You can make this as waterfall as you want. You can make it as iterative as you want, but generally something like this has to happen. Healthy Agile teams don't have as much delay in the middle. Unhealthy teams have lots of waits, but that's the definition. And we have a way of looking at these things. We put a board behind it. I explicitly, just as a note, I do not use the term cycle time. The way the Lean community picked it up for software is very different than how it's used in manufacturing. Rather than trying to fight that, I personally just dropped it from my vocabulary. And happy to have a discussion topic about that at the end of the session if you would like to. So continuing back to the talk track, we have this board. We have the active time, the touch time versus the wait time, and we can measure those things. And if you start to put the graph behind that, or the math behind that, you get to a definition of flow efficiency. We are all very familiar with resource efficiency. How busy are people? But we also need to pay attention to flow efficiency. Simple equation, the time you're working on divided by the total time it is in process. There's a lot of more formal ways to look at this. You can get approximations of it out of your tooling, but I just look at it from, we need to know roughly how well work flows. How much does it stop and start? Because that stop and start behavior is one of the crippling elements that leads to additional WIP constantly. And then I look at this, my challenge executives, what's your goal? Is your goal to keep people busy, or is your goal to keep shipping high value software? One of those is flow efficiency, one of those is resource efficiency. Ideally, I choose to believe that companies want a flow of value. And you get the version on the poster, like keep the value flowing, keep features out the door, or something like that. But if I look at it from an improvement goal, what I'm really driving is create the sustainable shortest lead time. It's part of the goal in the roof of the house of lean as SAFe uses it. And it, to me, is the single most important improvement metric you can focus on. Everything else we need to do in agility comes back to this idea of creating a sustainable shortest lead time. Over and over again, I can deliver healthy features in a short period that do not increase my total cost of ownership because of higher testing burdens and quality debt and so on. So when you have lots of work, can't you have both? Don't we get both because we keep people busy and focused? So tell me, are these cars moving? I don't have a bunch of people on video, so I can't tell if you're shaking your head or not. But are these cars moving? I'm guessing most of us took a look and said, generally no, a couple in the back might be. But my real question is, how can you know that? How can you know if they're moving on a static picture? It's just a photo. You have no motion here. How do you know they're not moving? Well, probably because they're too close together. And you know that if there's lots of things and they're close together on a road, they're probably not moving very fast, and they're probably more like a parking lot than a road. We know this in the real world. We see it. We feel it immediately. High utilization is the enemy. Thanks, Jeff. The same thing is true in software. When there's lots of work and there's any interactions between them, such as the same people working on them or the same people being information bottlenecks, you have slowdown behaviors. And that's where I start to talk about the tragedy of WIP. Because the work interacts through those workers, you have a classic tipping point pattern like this. As you increase the work items, the percent utilization in a system, the overall lead time, the time it takes to finish things, increases. So this starts to stack up. There is usually a tipping point knee bend like this. And we've seen this in traffic studies back to, I think the first one I found was 1912 or 11 in Paris when they looked at the ring road. And out of 80,000 cars per hour, this is 100 years ago, 80,000 cars per hour, the tipping point on that knee bend where speed went down and lead times went up was like a few hundred cars. It's a very narrow tipping point, but once you hit it, it climbs dramatically. We see it in network routers, we see it in traffic systems, and we see it in software development systems. When that happens, your lead time or your throughput goes down. And that's the real tragedy, is that by pushing more work in with the idea that you will get more, you are making it take longer and you are getting less of it. And many of you might know that as, just lost the word, well-known rule that we often talk about in Lean. I'll have to go back and find that. Little's Law, sorry. This is Little's Law. And this is where I show it to the executives and say, you are harming it. If it was get more by pushing it, even if it takes longer, that is a valid trade-off. we might choose that trade-off. But if you're pushing more work in and getting less and it's taking longer, I don't see a positive trade-off there unless it's to avoid political pain of telling people no. And sorry, you just got to do your job and tell people no. Also, as a consultant, I have the luxury of saying it depends in just about any environment. I'm going to tell you, in this one, I don't say it depends. You are here. I have worked in probably 100 organizations at this time of my career, and in only once have I been wrong when I say you have too much WIP. And that was actually an organization that was greenfield and they couldn't figure out how to get started. They were on the very far left and had nothing moving yet. This is the problem. This is the tragedy. Well-intentioned, we push more work in, trying to get more benefit for the company, and we're forcing everything to take longer and cost more on a per item basis, and we are getting less out the door. Pushing too hard creates less that comes out. And by the way, it's lower quality and less fit for purpose and all those other things we talked about earlier. That's the problem. That's the challenge we are up against. So I'm going to go quickly through this next section that I'm going to I'll send out the slides afterwards. So I'm going to hit a few of the slides at a high level and then fast forward through the rest. But there is incredible value in digging into the nuance of the work. What are the patterns of work? Because the patterns of how to solve the problem match to that. First is for a given piece of work, for a given team across different pieces of work, do they need to reconsider the approach they take on a per work item basis? Is it very repetitive? And I can just say, yeah, here's another one. It's going to flow through this process. It's going to be very similar to the last 50. We have to think about it. We have to do the work. There's still knowledge work involved, but they're very similar. Change requests against the same system, tickets against the same kind of work, things like that. Or is it very unique? Each one I have to step back and say, wow, how are we even approaching this problem? This one's different than everything we've done before. The last one was a machine learning data modeling problem. This one's actually a experience in UI exploration problem. And the next one is a feature that we just need to crunch through and write the config and implement it. Is it repetitive or is each one unique? The second factor I like to look at is, can we anticipate it? Do we know it's coming? Is it consistent? Or is it all reactive? Is it like, hey, we just had a security incident last night, we have to get involved? What is your responsibility? What is the mix of work that you have as a team? Third dimension I like to look at is how well aligned to a single business purpose are we? Are we disparate and I'm a shared service serving many different business units? Or am I a release train that's completely focused on the needs of one line of business and we have a single business owner the whole time? Those are the two dimensions there. And then the final dimension I look at is the predictability of the work. And it's a little bit like the planned versus unique path, but slightly different. Some work I know I'm going to be exploring for a while. User experience, and I'm going out and doing tests and working with users and understanding how they react. That's very experimental and exploratory. I can't tell you the path I'm going to take through it because it's completely dependent on what I learn along the way. AI work and machine learning, very similar. A lot of platform work and kind of back-end systems, that's very predictable. I know what I'm going to do. I have to learn a lot about this piece of software. I need to understand the outcomes. I need to understand the impact on our systems. We need to discuss our design as a team. We need to code it and test it, and then we're going to be able to release it. And of course, I'm using waterfall flow-based language to indicate the roles, but we'll do that iteratively, but it's fairly predictable. We know the path it's going to take. So we look across those four dimensions and ask, so what? Well, those patterns to me define the mandate of a team. And if I think about a team charter or team responsibilities or team level vision, the pattern of work they need to do and where it lays across those dimensions starts to define how I formulate their mandate and as a leader, how I expect them to behave. So what I'll do is I'll take these dimensions and map out what I expect. I'll just look at the work they've done. I'll look at the work they have in the future, and I'll understand the patterns. And if there's different patterns in play, I'll kind of draw two graphs and say, well, half their work is like this, but they also have some other work that's like this. And you see a set of patterns emerge. In fact, every rotation of this green around the axes, I've found an example of. So new product delivery or a new product feature, they're very goal aligned. They are working on a single product usually. Each feature requires different path because they're doing user experience. They're understanding different cohorts and things within the user base. But it's fairly plannable. We have a roadmap. We know roughly what we're going to be working at. And we have a lot of figuring out. If I rotate one step to customer love, it's very similar, except there's disparate work as I'm handling requests from a variety of customers. Whereas as I look to the new product, is much more roadmap based. So you kind of rotate it around. Data modeling rotates it again. Less unique path, very repetitive, but there's still a lot of exploration. And you kind of work your cycle around. Bill, I want to come back to that comment. It's a fascinating conversation. And some of them are interesting ones, like sometimes it's about legal and lawyers, and it's very defined path just for work. So open source reconciliation. Sorry, okay. Support teams, employee relation teams. You can kind of model this around all kinds of environments. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all those in detail. You can look at them in the slides if you're interested. But by modeling the team, you get to start to lay out against the problems. You start to understand their workflow, I'm sorry. My advice, though, is don't mix mandates, or if you do, be very clear which mandate is more important. So for one example I've seen in practice is I had a SWAT team, customer escalation. They were really good. They knew all the systems. They knew where problems come from. This was like the best team I'd ever met at figuring out what was leading in this huge complex architecture to a customer's problem, and then getting a fix in place and getting that customer satisfied in short order, like hours was their turnaround time. And one time I watched them and they were asked to, hey, that was amazing, good job. Can we make that a real feature? Can you just take that and finish fixing it? And of course, they're really happy. And what happened next? Boom, it blew up. You asked this team that was used to working in one mode to step over and work in a completely different mode of operations where they had no habits, no behaviors. They didn't know the right way to go through design reviews and security reviews and all the stuff that had to happen for good production-ready software. They were optimized for fast response, hack a solution together, make a customer outage go away, and then hand it to the development teams that actually knew the right way to fix things. We asked them to mix mandates. They stopped serving their previous customers and started blowing things up. Oops. Another example, support team. In this case was actually an anti-spam team working for a email provider. And they were kind of playing, their job was to play whack-a-mole against the internet, was the way they described their mission. Whenever a security threat popped up, they wanted to respond in hours or ideally minutes. And they had some spare time. There wasn't a constant stream of things. And noticing this extra capacity, a leader in the organization said, hey, you want to invest some of that time back into building the frameworks? Hey, I even want to be supportive. Let me give you a project manager to help keep track of those things so that you're not distracted when you don't have to pick up the pieces as quickly after you do an outage. Well-intentioned, really good idea, provided an extra person to help, and project managers did what project managers do. They provided status and reports, and people looked at those reports, and then the team started getting questions like, well, why isn't this moving forward? And when is this going to be done? This framework sounds really valuable. And over time, they kept working on these things, and boom, service levels suffered because they stopped playing whack-a-mole and started working on the projects because that's what was being reported on, and that's where the stress was coming back from. Somebody mixed mandates on them. It's not just playing whack-a-mole, it's also finishing these planned work items. Mixing mandates led to weird behaviors. Oops, I was one slide behind. And new product feature teams. Hey, we should probably, you built this, can you also take over bug fixes and maybe operate it in production? That seems valuable. Yeah, of course we can do that. Oh, this is DevOps. Are we doing DevOps right is one of the questions I like to leave behind with this section. We expect teams to take over operations. Do we equip them with the adjusted service mandates and behavioral mandates to allow them to do that and understand their real priority is to maintain and operate the system and then extend it when the system is healthy, as opposed to your new feature shop, who, by the way, also has to maintain the software. Do we have the mandates in the right spot for teams to be successful in a full-on DevOps mindset? So I'm going to pause there for questions before we move forward. We're pretty close to on track on timing. Bill, I agree that there's probably a dozen extra dimensions I've considered adding to that. Feel free to mix and match. I've found those 4 are the ones I've settled on because they fit the environments that I pay attention to. I heard there's a question at some point. High utilization in the enemy is why is that? Let me see how I can do drawing with my mouse real quick to answer this question. There's a graph in the book, This is Lean, that really shows the trade-off between flow and resource utilization. And what it basically says is there is a horizon, kind of like an investment horizon from investing, that you cannot be on. You can get or cannot get beyond. You can be on there where you have a very high resource efficiency, but a fairly low flow efficiency, or you can be here where you have a very high flow efficiency, but a low resource efficiency. This represents on the right people waiting around for a problem, but jumping on it as soon as it shows up and flowing it through. The top left represents being in a spot where you're fully loaded, but not everything's moving. You can move diagonally along this pretty easily by changing people's responsibilities and mandates, but it's really hard to break through that line. What we've learned in technology, if I can change my ink color, through automation, through some of the investments we can make in DevOps, immutable infrastructure, and things like that, that if we slow down, we can then move this direction through automation and then start to move back to this line. And through our investments in automation, start to break through to a new trade-off line. If you are familiar with Leading Safe and the content from Scaled Agile, you'll, in the principles section, there's kind of the curve that looks like this for the trade-offs between holding cost and transaction cost. And then they show that you can move that to the left. I might have drawn that wrong, but it's roughly correct. So high utilization almost always impedes flow, and that's kind of a universal law. It's one of those things that there's no way people have found around that other than by automating and taking work out so that you're changing the context. Cynthia, to your question, how would I organize the teams? I start with mandates. I'll talk about how I organize in some of these strategies coming up, so we'll come back to that. Michael, I look at it at the team or at least the release train level from a mandate perspective, because that's, and I think Agile, I live Agile, I breathe Agile. Teams are my unit of action and capacity, and that's the level at which I can have different mandates. I suppose you could do it at an individual level, but then we wouldn't be Agile and wouldn't be working with teams. Aggregating the metrics, I absolutely aggregate the performance metrics. I'm a huge fan of the flow metrics that Mick Kirsten put in Project to Product and show up in his book and in the Tasktop tool. And then for those of you who may not have noticed, Scaled Agile actually put those flow metrics along with a couple others as the key metrics in SAFe now if you click through the metrics article. The Lean book is This is Lean. So I'll just type the title. It's probably, I think it was translated in English like in 2012, 2013. I believe it was Swedish originally, but it's the best, simplest book understanding lean mindset that I've come across. It's the one I recommend if executives want a short book on understanding lean. It's the one I send them at. All right, if there's no more questions popping up, I will see if I can get my pen back to a pointer. I'll be able to click again. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, there are a handful of larger scale strategies, big things that take time to have the real impact, but by doing them, you can actually solve the root cause. And there's also a handful of tactics that can create some breathing room and space that we'll talk about next. The first and the most important thing I have found to fix work in process is give people the permission to say, this does not align with our goals right now. And to do that, you have to have alignment on what we're trying to achieve and what our intent is as an organization. What's our strategy? What's the most important outcomes for the company? And what are the key moves that we as an organization are taking to get there? And if my work is not part of one of those, I have the right to challenge it. And that last part is important. It has to be permission-based. When you have this, fewer people have to get involved in the trade-off decisions. It doesn't have to go all the way up to the CEO and back over through another silo to get a trade-off. You and the business are already aligned on what the most important outcomes are, and you can work more laterally within a level or within a teams to make those decisions. Why everybody talks about OKRs right now? Why not? They're kind of my favorite. Let's understand what our big goal is. Let us understand what our next strategies are. And by the way, we should probably also talk about why we believe that is the most important strategy, just in case it's not clear from the slogan version and the poster version what's important. People need to understand the backgrounds. That takes time though. You can't just turn on organizational alignment by flipping a switch. Strategy 2, alignment in a reduction in depth. I became an executive consultant by accident because I kept climbing the stack as I realized every level in the organization was incapable of solving the work and process problem. So I took it to the next level. And I said, well, how do we have fewer capabilities we're trying to build right now? Oh, well, we have to do this to meet the strategy. Cool. So I go talk to the people who own the strategy. Hey, how do we focus our strategies? Well, in order to meet the board commitments, we have to have these 5 things. And I had a point where I was talking to the CEO of a fairly meaningful company, and the CEO was powerless in the face of this. The CEO was using disempowerment language that we couldn't fix it. So the only way I found is to try to make small improvements at every layer of the organization. Can we take 5 epics out of our 50? Can we take 20 features out of this train's backlog? Can we let this team commit to 5 fewer stories this iteration? Can we drop or reduce the targets on 1 or 2 of our strategies to create a little more space across the organization? You can't fix this at the team. The team has to do everything. They don't have executive authority to stop work. Agile says they should, but they don't in most companies. They're going to get told. We need to work top to bottom to create a little bit of reduction at the top that cascades from those 47 initiatives or whatever the number was to 42 to 35, and just take a little bit out. Creating focus should be a critical role of an executive. And they're actually really good at that. They know that if they show up and focus on a thing, everybody else focuses with them because they're the executive. It's the directed telescope Napoleon talks about. But at the same time, they have to also take them off the list. They have to remove them from the investment slate. They have to take them out of the strategy for the year, whatever the language is. But I don't say that the focus of the exec should be removing work. I say the focus of the executive should be to create focus in the team so you're achieving the outcomes you want. And focus is the opposite of whip. Bill, I would take this a team of teams. I sit at the executive table in Fortune 50 companies and talk about what needs to pull out sometimes because it happens at every layer. The highest leverage is at the strategy level. When I was working with a bank in the Southern Hemisphere and I got them to remove one of their top 5 strategies for the year, and it created a landslide of progress on the other 4. And it was just like eye-opening for everybody involved. Third strategy, and I alluded to this in the overview, we have to create safety. We have to create the environment in organizational health to allow people to challenge whether this is important. Because right now, for most companies I work in the Fortune 50, the answer is yes, I can do that. You ask me to do it, I can do it. And in the back of my mind, I'm probably thinking, well, I'll sit this down, I'm sitting this down. But we don't say that. And we need to learn to. And there's ways to do that as a leader. You invite that is what it boils down to. Well, can you share back what I just asked you to do and your concerns just to make sure we're on the same page? Do you have room for this? my work fit challenges is one of my favorite. This is my favorite thing to do with product managers when I'm working with them, is product managers move it from a prove it won't fit to a prove it will mindset. So I have one more feature. The team says, yeah, I think we can fit that in. It's like, prove it. Show me you can fit this in, as opposed to find a way to fit this in. And if they can't prove it, you refuse to let them start it. And if you can get product leaders doing that, it's culture shattering. It changes everything from a work in process mindset where teams like, oh, you're not pressuring me. You're not forcing me to do this. You're inviting, you're telling me that if I can't prove I can do it, I'm not going to have to. Wow, that's powerful. And then there's the fail fast, which I prefer to call learn fast. There's the creating space and encouraging experimentation, even though it takes longer, and making that even though it takes longer explicit, and so on. And then there's another one that I love this language. It was a VP of the PMO at one of my clients that actually shared it. And he said, oh, we just need to learn how to put things down gently. Because part of the reason why you're not allowed to set anything down is because you're used to things being dropped. And it's like, if you can put it down gently, we can pause it. Tell me what you're going to put down, and let's plan how to set it down. And that was actually a key change for them. They started thinking in terms of, oh, we're allowed to stop. We just have to show how we're going to do it without breaking things. And then the fourth element to attend to is change and change management is WIP. Back at that story at the beginning, this is where it became personal, is of those 7 things on the list, 2 of them were mine. I was leading the Agile transformation. I had put them as cross-functional or cross-organization initiatives. I made the problem worse. Well-intentioned, trying to create capacity through agility, but I made it worse by putting more things in. We need to pay attention. Change management and the emotional impact of change consumes WIP. It takes the place of WIP. It consumes capacity off the top of people's buckets, and it decreases what's available for everything else, which means all that WIP that was perfectly comfortable 4 days before you started the release train launch is now too much WIP. And as change management consumes capacity too, has impact, it requires emotional engagement, it needs sustained attention, that takes stuff away from everything else. And then 5, systemic dependencies. I added this one in the last version of the talk. The more I look at things across companies, I'm an architect by training. I came through the application and solution architecture path into change management. And my mindset now is that Conway's Law trumps everything. The architectural opportunity in most enterprises is possibly the biggest strategic opportunity to reduce WIP and create better throughput. And DevOps has taught us a lot. Serverless, API-driven development, decoupling, all those things that technical agilists know and love and have been pushing us to do since the day of the manifesto and before, if you're kept back. We need to attend to them. We've not actually learned that much new about architecture concepts in the last 20 years, but we have to apply them. And we need to co-evolve the organization structure through agility and how we team, and the architecture, and each can limit the other. So we need to work together. Jeff, thank you for calling out team topologies. It's one of my favorites, and I'm juggling it everywhere. Networks of value streams, yeah, all that stuff. We know the answers, but we have to apply it in the enterprise. And remember, change cost cycles, so you're going to have to make room. If you're an Agilist, by the way, and you haven't read team topologies, please put it near the top of your list. You should not be trying to scale Agile using any model without thinking through and applying the concepts there. It is also one of my new favorites as a modeling notation for describing the shape and design of organizations. Like, it's a simple notation, it's very clear, and there's even Miro plugins to use the shapes. Okay, 7 minutes left. Tactics. First thing, kill some backlogs. Take the work in the top left and get rid of it. So if you map across how valuable something is and how costly it is to do, classic trade-off. WSGIF is exactly the same thing with more words. Way to throw us job first. Find the stuff that is prioritized and accepted and eliminate the stuff that you should eliminate and maybe even throw away some to consider. What this looks like as a leader is admitting that 30% of your backlog will never happen and deleting it. And I'm not joking about that. Take 30% of the bottom of your backlog and delete it, see if anybody notices. My friend Jennifer, she's now at CVS. She has a habit of wandering around teams and just deleting things at the bottom of backlogs in Rally. Phenomenal trick. Nobody ever notices. Pace chart, by the way, is the formal lean technology. If you've heard me speak before, I used to call this quick ROI before I discovered somebody else invented it before I did. Tactic 2, clarify change. You're going to, pace chart, PACE, just for off the acronyms. Clarifying organizational change. We love to throw teams into chaos by changing things around them, launching release trains, changing org structures, deploying new security initiatives, all these things that are important. At least make the change explicit and wrap the same kind of OKRs around that as you would around anything else. Make it clear people are much more comfortable with things if they understand why this change is happening and understand the change. So are you the kind of leader who overinvests in communicating purpose? Third, write some team charters. You have that chart. I've given you some dimensions to look at. Sit down with the team and just kind of write out what is your mandate. Look at your work pattern and then make a decision. Forever in Scrum, we've been talking about, well, if we have to handle escalations, how do we model it? Do we create placeholder stories, blah, 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 blah. Why don't we just write a vision and a charter for the team that says, if escalations come in, they come first, and then new story work happens after that. And if we don't finish our goal because of escalation work, so be it. We will not be held accountable. And then you can go and apply the capacity reservation and story placeholders and all that, but write the mandate first. Make it clear that, because at some point, no matter what rule you put into place for managing capacity, you will break it. At some point, there will be 5 escalations in the same sprint when you only planned for 3. And at that point, the team will be forced to choose which way to tip. Are we going to do the escalation work and throw away our plan? Or are we going to do the planned work and ignore the escalation? At some point, you will hit that limit, no matter how much you buffer it. Make sure the team knows which answer wins. As a leader, I like to hang these up for my teams. I'll put them on the wall the same way I put my art canvases and train canvases on the wall to see the shape of a safe organization. I'll put the team mandates right below it. And before I go talk to a team to see if they can do something, I look at that mandate and I say, is this worth it? Does it fit their value? If I make them do this or ask them to take on this responsibility, is it going to change the flow of value through that organizational team that I created? And is it worth the disruption to do this? And then I'll decide if I go talk to them or not. And if I do, I might make that decision. I'm the leader, they're my team. I can change their mandate, but I'm going to be explicit about it. And then I mentioned this earlier, but practice that, flip it around, challenge a team to say, prove you can fit this work rather than prove you can't fit it. And you are creating space for your teams to make better decisions. So, summary slide for the different ways out of the tragedy of WIP. The ones on the left, you need to be the type of leader who works with others to create these changes. The ones on the right, you need to be the type of leader who creates that impact through your own behaviors. Walk away question, what will you do from all of this? And I'd love to see you type this into chat in the last 2 minutes we have. As a leader, what will you start practicing out of what we have learned today? And I'd love to see that in chat. I'll leave the contact slide up here so you can get in touch with me. Like I said, hit me up on LinkedIn. Feel free to just mention you were in this session in the note in LinkedIn, and I'll accept immediately. If your title is at all Agile related, I'll accept it immediately. What will you do? And with that, I probably have time for 1.5 questions. If anybody has a question based on the material that you'd like to answer now, otherwise feel free to ask on LinkedIn. I'm generally fairly responsive there.
All right. Well, thanks, Eric, for joining and doing this session. Great session. I am going to stop the recording now, though, as well.